Well, greetings. Welcome. Glad you're here. We are gathered together once again for another exciting episode in church history. And in fact, we have now made it all the way up to the church in America. If you recall, and I hope you do, the last time we sort of ended the session by talking about the church as it showed up in America in the very earliest days, and that happened to be in the form of Catholic missionaries who arrived with the Spanish conquistadors or conquerors or whatever you want to call them. And if you want to limit America to discussions of what happened on this particular continent, not offshore in the islands or in Central or South America, the first incursion would probably be in Florida, in places like St. Augustine, and the Catholic missionaries were at work there. Of course, the motivation for people coming to the New World at all, whether they were Spanish Catholics or English Protestants or whomever else, was not really missionary activity. It was looking for gold, and that's what they were doing. When they did find some gold, probably not as much as they thought. They certainly kept looking for El Dorado, the fabled city of gold, which didn't turn out to be anywhere. But they did find gold in the form of human slaves. They hauled many of those back to Europe, and they also wreaked havoc on the human population here. And I'm not just simply talking about Catholics, although at that particular point in history, that's what was going on. And in fact, as they moved further north, they did encounter some Huguenots in the Carolinas and carrying out the religious persecution and hostilities that were found already in Europe. They continued those things here, and so they killed some of those Huguenots that they ran into. Of course, there's still some Huguenots there, as we've talked about earlier. Okay, there were also some very good, sincere, committed Catholic missionaries. Some of them were coming down, not up from Florida, but down south out of Canada, down the Mississippi, establishing colonies in various places, St. Louis, New Orleans, and so forth. So we talked about that, and that was again in some of the very earliest of days. And I'm not really talking so much chronologically here as we develop some of the rest of this story as talking about groups, and so there'll be overlapping of time, but it's somewhat chronological as well, and hopefully that'll make some sense as we proceed through this. Nevertheless, to leave all that behind, we're going to start again talking about groups and their activities here in America. And I'm going to begin by talking about the Episcopal Church. It was the first Protestant church to be active here in what we consider North America. It was in 1607 that King James I granted a charter to establish a permanent colony in the New World, and that was Jamestown. And again, the purpose of the colony was they were looking for gold. The rumor had always been that the New World was just covered in gold. All they had to come over here and do was come over here and pluck it off the trees or pick it up off the ground, and didn't really work quite that way. But while they came along with that effort to find gold primarily in mind, they did come with some, at least, lip service to theological concerns. When they granted the charter to build Jamestown, it was done in the hopes that the colony would, and I quote from that charter, that colony may, by the providence of Almighty God, hereafter tend to the glory of His divine majesty in propagating the Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness and in ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God. So they had that in mind. And they did not completely ignore that. I don't know exactly how much missionary activity was going on in those earliest of days, but the very first public building that the colony in Jamestown built was a chapel made out of wood and cloth, but they eventually, and well, not before too much longer, they did substitute a stone church for that wooden and cloth chapel. And because the earliest of the colonies were English, the Church of England, which is in America called the Episcopal Church, was the state church of Virginia and the Carolinas and Georgia, and in other times, sometimes in some of the other colonies as well. So these early colonies did have official state churches. And because these colonies did turn out to be permanent and they had no intentions of leaving, they did have the need for training ministers over here. And so they established the College of William and Mary for the education of Episcopal ministers to serve in the colonies. And the Episcopal Church was the dominant church in the southern colonies. Now, as I said, the earliest settlers to Virginia, and I suppose you could say the other colonies as well, did come looking for gold and didn't find an awful lot of gold, but they did find some wealth. But the wealth that they found did not come from finding gold, but it came from agriculture, primarily from the growing of tobacco. However, remember, these people who came over here and built these great plantations were not people who were likely to be found working in those fields themselves, and so very fortuitously, and I say that with some great cynicism, it was only 12 years after the founding of Jamestown that the first boatload of African slaves arrived in this world, on this new continent over here, which allowed for cheap labor and allowed for the building of wealth. So in one sense, they did find gold. Another interesting fact about church life, especially in the Episcopal Church, was that while they did create the College of William and Mary for the education of ministers, guess it's still working, hope you can hear okay. While they did establish that college for the educating of ministers, there were no bishops in the colonies, and so that really meant that after someone was educated and ready to be ordained, they had to go back to England in order to be ordained by a bishop there in England. It's also the case that since it is a state church, and since over here they were official churches of the state, the ministers in the Episcopal Church in the colonies were supported by the state and also by endowment system. And it probably is also fair to say that the like the leaders, other leaders of the colonies, the ministers in the Episcopal Church, at least some of them were influenced by deism. Talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So that really meant that they were not given much to evangelistic zeal. And the result of that was that they began to lose members, especially out in the West and among the poor. They lost members to the Presbyterians, to Methodist and Baptist, and we'll talk more about that in a little later. But the real point was that the Episcopal Church finally did cease to be the dominant religion in those southern colonies, or in the colonies generally. Now, if you remember last time when we were talking about the Reformation in Britain, we talked about the Puritans, and we talked about the separatists and some of their activities there in England, and we talked a little bit about some of those separatists who wanted to separate as completely as they possibly could, and some of them left and went to Presbyterian Holland, and there they did find a very comfortable home. They were in complete agreement with those Presbyterians and their Calvinism, and so they taught and they preached that Calvinism, and they argued against the teachings of another Dutchman, Jacobus Arminius, and his his theology called Arminianism, which is still alive. In fact, it seems to me that it has become dominant, primarily because Arminianism was all about free will as opposed to that Calvinism, which was all about predestination. Now, the leader of those separatists there in Holland was a man named William Brewster, and he liked to write pamphlets, and some of his pamphlets did make their way back to England, and in fact, he went back to England himself. But the pamphlets found their way into the hands of King James, and the pamphlets angered King James, and so he went after William Brewster. And William Brewster was in England at that time, but decided that he wasn't safe, so he needed to get out, and so he went back to Holland. But that group of separatists, under the leadership of William Bradford, decided that they needed to separate from the whole business altogether and head off to America. And of course, you know that we are talking about our group of separatists, our group of Puritans that we know of as Pilgrims. And so they prepared to leave in 1620 and come to the New World. However, they were not the first group of separatists to leave England and head for the New World. Before the Pilgrims came over here, a group of 200 of them had settled into a little boat and headed out for the New World. And while they were on their way, disease broke out. And when they finally landed in Chesapeake Bay, of that 200 that had left, only 50 remained alive, and they soon scattered, and so they were able to establish no permanent settlement. And the Pilgrims, before they left, they knew of this story, and they were scared, unsure whether they should do it or not. However, they entered into a period of prayer and fasting and became convinced that yes, that was God's will for them to come, separate into a new colony of their own where they could live as they wished, and at the same time bring the Word of God to the darkness of the New World. So, as you probably know much of the story, 102 passengers crowded onto that little boat called the Mayflower, and they set out. And of those 102, 32 of them were children. 2 of the women were pregnant, and one of them did give birth on the voyage over here. And interestingly, and very appropriately, they named the child Oceanus. And so they did land, and while they were anchored offshore, another baby was born. And so again, the first new births after the Pilgrims left England. Well, they landed in November of 1620. You know, it just kind of seems like bad planning. You know, is this really the time that you want to land in New England? How well provisioned are you? Can you really get through the winter and so forth? And the reality of the situation is that an awful lot of them didn't. As a matter of fact, only half of them survived the winter. But when the springtime came, they did plant crops, they harvested fish, and we all know the story, although I'm not sure that we all know it very well. They did celebrate their Thanksgiving. And however it happened, they did share that first meal with the Indians. And the way I think the story was always told, that I heard it in my various earliest of years, was that they shared their Thanksgiving meal with the Indians because they had helped them and taught them how to plant and did a bunch of things like that. Whereas what I have read actually happened was the Indians crashed the party. But they did share, and so anyway, it's a great story no matter how it happened. And what it did, of course, was morph into Thanksgiving, which is America's only unique religious holiday. Now, remember that word, unique. Of course, we have religious holidays, Christmas, Easter, and probably a few more thrown in there, but they're not unique to us. Thanksgiving is, I guess. I need to research that a little further, I suppose. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about the Puritans and what they were trying to do here. Again, they came to New England and their goal was to establish not only a colony for Great Britain, but also a kingdom for God, the kingdom of God, to be built in the new land. Their first great leader here was John Winthrop, and he is still somewhat famous among us, even if we don't really know his name. It was in 1630 that he came over on a ship called the Arabella, and he was coming over here to become the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And on his way over here, he wrote that speech that seems to be quoted relatively frequently these days. I think the first time I ever heard it currently, it's not current anymore, 35 years or so ago, President Reagan used the phrase about how we should be a city on a hill, we Americans, that America should be a city on a hill. And in fact, that is what John Winthrop wrote. And his quote is, "We shall be as a city on a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. But if our hearts shall turn away, we shall surely perish out of the good land, whether we pass over this vast sea to possess it." Prophetic words, perhaps. We could spend a while talking about what it would mean for our hearts to turn away, whether that has happened, and whether we shall surely perish out of the good land, and what that might mean, and all kinds of things. But nevertheless, it's certainly food for thought. And boy, it is a proud dream that we should be as a city on a hill. Okay, well, the Puritans kept coming, and there was much suffering. Of the first 1,000 of the Puritans who came over here, 200 of them returned to England. Another 200 would die during their first winter. And again, this is more than just came over on the Mayflower. But in 10 years, there would be 20,000 of them who would come. Now, what did they do after they got here? Well, of course, they cleared the fields and they built houses and they built villages and so forth. And they also did worship. And if you might wonder what worship would look like in those days, in those Puritan villages, here is one description of worship that at least one congregation experienced on one day. Someone wrote, "This day was one of the sweetest I have seen." After Dr. Twizy had begun with a brief prayer, Mr. Marshall prayed 2 large hours, most divinely confessing the sins of the membership with the assembly in a wonderful, pathetic, and prudent way. After Mr. Arrowsmith preached 1 hour, then a psalm, Mr. Vines prayed nearly 2 hours. You know, I just don't think most of us could stand that these days. I remember in one case, one church, we were having some kind of meeting and somebody stood up and he said that if a service goes longer than 60 minutes, then the minister is imposing on the time of the congregants. And I did give myself the freedom to object rather strenuously. I did say that I had never heard anyone anywhere say that a worship service had to be limited to 60 minutes. It says nowhere in the Bible anything like that. So I don't know exactly where this guy was getting that idea. Never had any session tell me that I had to limit it to 60 minutes. However, I must tell you that I do try to do that. Try to aim for that. Sometimes it doesn't quite happen, and I usually feel bad about it. Although I must say, for Ireland's, nobody's ever complained when it's gone over. But nevertheless, want you to know, I do aim for that. Doesn't always work. Okay, that's what that one fellow described in terms of one worship experience that he had in that Puritan village during those years. It doesn't seem to be the typical pattern. More often you would hear a sermon that lasted 2 or 3 hours with only an hour or so devoted to prayer, and that would happen twice on Sunday and maybe another time during the week. So they did, you had to be pretty committed to be a real church person in those days. It's also confusing to know how many people were actually doing that. Um, we often talk about the good old days. Um, and I shouldn't even use any of this data because I'm not terribly sure just exactly how accurate it is. But we have, again, our discussion, our thoughts or our definitions of the good old days were that everybody was in church on Sunday, and they weren't. What I've heard is that in colonial days, only 17% of the population were members of churches. So not quite sure exactly how all that was filtering down into daily life. We often also say that the Pilgrims and the Puritans generally came over here for freedom of religion, and that is true. They came for freedom of religion. They came for freedom of religion for themselves. Certainly the society that they created here was not freedom of religion for everybody. If you were a citizen of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you could not simply believe anything that you wanted to believe. As a matter of fact, there were those who were preaching and teaching different things, and so the Massachusetts Bay Colony did pass laws to ensure that their way of believing and practicing the religion was held to be permanent and official. And there were those again who did come in with alternative teachings. Some of them had to do. Some of them were Quakers. There were others who had heretical ideas as well. There was a woman named Mary Dyer. She was expelled from the colony for being a heretic, and she returned as a Quaker missionary to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and she was arrested, and she was forced to watch as her 3 associates were hanged. She herself was spared hanging, perhaps because she was a woman, but she did not stop what she was doing. She continued to preach, and so finally Ann Dyer herself was hanged in Boston as an enemy of true religion. So freedom of religion, yes. Freedom of religion, no. Okay, well, moving on to something else that was very important to church life, not only in New England, but as it turned out for all of America, and that is a movement that was called the First Great Awakening. Now, note that phrase first, because we're going to talk about a second Great Awakening, not today, but the First Great Awakening appeared in the 1730s. And if you had gone to a church in Northampton, Massachusetts in those years, you would have heard one of America's truly great preachers and America's, probably it's fair to say, America's greatest theologian. His name was Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, you may have heard, I don't know if they're still doing it, but I know when I was in school, we had to read one of Jonathan Edwards' sermons. And you probably remember it, and you remember the title if you don't remember anything else. It was called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And he used this imagery about how sinners were held over the fires of hell like a spider on a filament of web and could be dropped at any time and so forth. And that was really not that typical of Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards typically was preaching about the love of God in saving hell-bent sinners. He would emphasize that more than that threatened judgment, although that was certainly a part of it. But again, Edwards is America's greatest theologian, but not simply because of that. I'll say a little bit more about Jonathan Edwards in just a little bit. But to talk more about this Great Awakening, this Great Awakening began there in Northampton, Massachusetts. And if you had visited Jonathan Edwards' church, you might have been amazed at what you saw. You might see people weeping over conviction of their sins. You might see people laughing out of joyfulness that they had been redeemed for that. Or they might be crying out in terror because they were afraid that they were going to hell. And Edwards, very scholarly, read his sermons, and he had no desire for any kind of sensationalism whatsoever. So he didn't really understand what was going on about this. Thought maybe this just had to be some mysterious or even miraculous work of the Holy Spirit. And so, hey, let it happen. And it did. And it spread from Northampton all the way through the colonies. That spreading happened in large part because of the work of another English preacher who had come to America. His name was George Whitefield. Man, he must have been something. I wish there were recordings. He wrote a lot, so there's plenty of the writings of George Whitefield too, but that could not possibly substitute for his preaching ability. Let's just go ahead and put it that way. I've heard a couple of things that were said about him. There was a great English actor whose name I don't remember right now, but he said that he would give anything if he only had George Whitefield's ability to say, "Oh." And it was said that he could move crowds to tears simply by saying the word Mesopotamia. And I'm sure all of you right now are just weeping there in your sofas listening to me say it. Anyway, Whitefield traveled throughout the colonies, preaching up a storm, and just drew enormous crowds everywhere that he went. If he were here today, no doubt he would have been a great televangelist. He was the ultimate spellbinder. Many thousands of people were converted. Churches were strengthened because George Whitefield had visited their community. Benjamin Franklin went to hear him in Philadelphia, and it was said that Franklin was not converted, but Franklin was moved enough to give him some money when they took up the offering. So I guess that's something. But it's also the case that Franklin, being a printer, worked out a deal with Whitefield to publish his writings, and so made a lot of money off George Whitefield. And I suppose I keep saying I grew up certainly not as a little boy, but I learned to say Whitefield, and I think the proper pronunciation is Whitefield. But nevertheless, Benjamin Franklin was able to make money off of George Whitefield, but Whitefield was out there preaching and converting thousands and so forth. And he was just preaching from everywhere. There weren't many places that could actually hold the throngs that wanted to hear him. In fact, as far as I know, there were none in most places that wanted to hear him. I pastored a church in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and behind that church there was called the Welsh Mountain. And on the other side of Welsh Mountain there was a Presbyterian church called the Peckway Presbyterian Church. It was pretty small even at the time, and we're going back, how many years, 35 years ago now. So I have no idea. I certainly hope the Peckway Presbyterian Church is still there, but I don't know anything about what's happening to it currently. But I know that George Whitefield preached there, but there certainly wasn't room in that small, tiny little Presbyterian church out in the middle of nowhere for them to worship in the church. So George Whitefield preached from a tree out in the outside the church, and throngs of thousands gathered around the tree to hear George Whitefield. That's been how many years ago? Are we talking at least 300, almost 300 years ago now? So the tree has not survived. However, when the tree did come down, they made a table from the wood of that tree, and the last count I had, the Peckway Presbyterian Church still had the table made from the wood from the tree from which George Whitefield preached. So there's a little bit of little tidbit there for you. Back up and pick up just a little bit more about Jonathan Edwards. As I said, probably the greatest theologian that America has produced. He had been the pastor of a church in New York City, which is now the First Presbyterian Church. It's down in Greenwich Village. In subsequent years, that church had been pastored by someone named Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was a Baptist and a liberal Baptist. And because he was liberal, there were fundamentalists in the Presbyterian Church back in the 1920s that rebelled against the idea of this liberal Baptist preaching from this Presbyterian pulpit. So he resigned, and John Rockefeller Jr. wanted to give him a place to preach, and so he built Riverside Church so that Harry Emerson Fosdick would have a place to preach. And that church, of course, is still standing and still in operation. Also, if you have not heard of Harry Emerson Fosdick, you certainly have sung his hymn, God of Grace and God of Glory. As a matter of fact, I think you will be hearing it by recording in this Sunday's worship service. Also, just a quick note, that church was subsequently pastored in years later by a man named John Walton, who just retired within a couple of years ago. And John was my senior pastor in my first job out on Long Island after graduating from seminary. And so it was always interesting to watch John and to listen to some of his sermons, best Presbyterian preacher I ever heard. Anyway, a little bit more about Jonathan Edwards. After he left Northampton, he followed his father-in-law as president of the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton University. And he had been there about a month when the new smallpox epidemic was certainly in effect, and the new inoculation had been developed. And as an example to the community, Jonathan Edwards received the inoculation, and it backfired, and he got smallpox, and he died after having spent only 1 month in Princeton, before his wife had even been able to join him there in that post. And I said that he had succeeded his father-in-law, who had been the president of the College of New Jersey. And as it happens, his father-in-law was Aaron Burr Sr., a Presbyterian minister who was, of course, the father of Aaron Burr Jr., well known for having had a duel with Alexander Hamilton and winning the duel and losing pretty much everything else as a result of it. Nevertheless, that's the case. Interestingly, one of the, I'm not alone in this, but I think old cemeteries are very fascinating, and not hardly any more fascinating than the cemetery in Princeton. And just, I could talk about the cemetery there for some time, but I won't. But among the graves there is a plot called the President's Plot, in which the presidents of the seminary are buried, and I assume in years gone by, the presidents of the university too, although they're not mingling those two any longer. But there in that you will find the grave of Jonathan Edwards, and you will find the grave of Aaron Burrs Sr. and Jr. So it's kind of interesting, for me at least, to stand there and look at those things. And if you're ever in there, I don't mean if you're ever in the cemetery, I hope you're there only visiting, but nevertheless, it's an interesting place, and to see those graves, again, some of us at least find that kind of thing interesting. All right, to move on to some of the other groups in the early American church life. I'm going to talk about the Baptists next. The Episcopalians lacked ministers, and they were also very much wedded to formal worship. And also their services used that Book of Common Prayer from the Church of England. And so the point is that they were not in great place to benefit from the revival, the First Great Awakening, but other churches certainly did. One of them was the Baptist Church. As I said, you were not free to believe anything you wanted to believe up in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and one of those who found himself on the receiving end of that persecution, you might say, was a man named Roger Williams. He was banished by those Puritans in New England, and he founded the colony of Rhode Island. And he became a Baptist, at least for a while. And in 1638, he founded the first Baptist church in America. It was the first Baptist church in America, and that's what it's still called, First Baptist Church in America. So it's still there in Providence. John Clark is actually considered to be the father of Baptists in America. It was in 1640 that he began to be the pastor of the Newport Baptist Church. And he was arrested for preaching Baptist doctrines there. And there were other Baptists in other places that were also suffering persecution as a result of this. There was a man named Harry Dunster. He was actually the first president of Harvard. And he made a terrible mistake. He became a Baptist, and he was forced to resign because of that. And an interesting little tidbit there about that story is that one of the factors in his conversion to the Baptist was the example of a man named Obadiah Holmes. He was also convicted of being a Baptist, and he was given a fine for being a Baptist, and another man offered to pay his fine for him, and Holmes declined to let that man pay his fine for him, and so he settled for a beating for being a Baptist. Well, it was down, especially in the South, that the Baptists profited greatly by the Great Awakening, but they also did suffer as a result of their growth. In 1763, a man named Colonel Samuel Harris was mobbed and beaten for being a Baptist, beaten with sticks and whips and clubs, and that was in Culpeper County, Virginia. And in Orange County, Virginia, another Baptist was dragged down the street by his hair. Also in Virginia, an Episcopalian parson led a mob that attacked and beat a Baptist named John Walter. And between the years of 1765 and 1775, a number of Baptists were continued to be beaten by people in the South who were trying to repress the development of and growth of the Baptist. The excuse for harassing Baptists like that, among the many things they were charged with, was that they were cruel to children in delaying them baptism. I guess if you take your theology seriously enough, then yeah, maybe that's exactly the case. But nevertheless, that's part of what was going on. But the Baptists did grow rapidly, and they did grow rapidly out, especially into the expanding frontier areas of the South and then on out to the West, especially among the unsophisticated frontiersmen. To start a Baptist church, you did not have to send your minister to England to be ordained, and you didn't have it like the Episcopalians did, and you did not have to send him out east for advanced education like the Presbyterians did. Most Baptist ministers were farmers. And that meant, among other things, that they spoke the language of their people, and they called for repentance and conversion as adults, and believed in baptism by immersion, which is a very dramatic way of demonstrating your conversion and your new life as a Christian. Another group that grew quite rapidly as a result of the Great Awakening was the Methodists. The Methodists had been started by John Wesley. Now, John Wesley was an Anglican priest. Must have been a type A personality, or at least he was a workaholic and had to get her done. Matter of fact, it was said that John Wesley, well, he preached everywhere. He did preach in some churches, but he also preached from fields. He preached in mines. He preached everywhere, He said, "The world is my parish." And it is said that he traveled by foot or by horseback the equivalent of 10 times around the world. And in the process of doing that, preached 50,000 sermons. And he wasn't the only one in the family who was busy. He had a brother named Charles. Charles was a hymn writer. Charles wrote 6,500 hymns. Boggles the mind, really. I've thought in the past that Charles Wesley's wife never had to ask the question, I wonder where Charles is and what he's doing. She knew where he was, she knew what he was doing. He was there in his study writing hymns. And out of those 6,500 hymns, some of them were pretty good. As a matter of fact, some of them are some we by no means reserved only to the Methodists. We Presbyterians sing them too. Some of his songs or hymns are Love Divine, All Loves Excelling, Hark, the Herald Angels Sing, Christ the Lord is risen today, Come thou long expected Jesus, and oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing. And of course, if I wanted to keep reading the titles of his hymns, I could go on for the rest of the day, I suppose, and I'm not inclined to do that. Well, a couple of things to say about Wesley was that he rejected the Anglican, and again, Anglican and Episcopalian are the part of the same thing. Anglican essentially being a form of the word English. But Wesley rejected the Anglican idea of apostolic succession, which is the idea that the apostles ordained priests and those who came after them, and that laying on of hands has gone on down through the centuries, and so it's important for bishops to continue to lay their hands on the ordinands because of apostolic succession. However, Wesley rejected that and began to ordain ministers himself. The other thing about Wesley is that he rejected at least most of Calvinism, and seems, I think it's fair to say, to have adopted the theology of that Jacobus Arminius and his emphasis on free will rather than on predestination. You could accept God's grace if you wanted it, and you could reject it if you didn't want it. Well, that's huge. I think it's one. I don't know. I'm not aware of a whole lot of people who are very strict Calvinists these days, and here I am, a minister in a Calvinist denomination, at least in terms of heritage. The other thing about Wesley was that he emphasized godly living. In fact, he created a method of what it meant to be a Christian, and thereby came the term Methodist. If you adhere to Wesley's method. Wesley did come to America, and things really did not go very well for him here. Got engaged, and before marrying his fiancée, just left, went back to England. Okay, Methodism still grew. Methodism became famous for something you probably know about, the circuit riders. So the circuit riders were not dependent on being clergy in a localized church. They traveled from town to town on horseback, had this circuit in which they would hold meetings and so forth. And that helped the Methodists to reach the pioneers much more effectively than any other group except the Baptists. Okay, going to talk just for a little bit here about a couple of other groups. One is the Lutherans. It was in 1638 that the first Lutheran church was established, and that was in Wilmington, Delaware. As a matter of fact, the first book that was translated into a Native American dialect was Luther's Small Catechism. I'm sure those Native Americans were happy to get that. But maybe they were, who am I to say? But eventually, of course, while that was a rather small beginning, mass exodus from Lutheran countries in Europe to America, including this part of America, firmly established Lutheranism in this country. It's another little interesting story about the Lutherans is that in 1775, a man named John Muhlenberg, who was a pastor in Woodstock, Virginia, led morning worship. He preached his sermon, and after he finished, he pulled open his ministerial robe, and beneath it, he was dressed in the uniform of the Continental Army, ready to go off and join in the revolution that had begun. Say just a little bit about the Quakers. Quakers I think we all have a respect for the Quakers. They've had a strong voice for peace and justice in the world. They still do. They're a quiet group. They're out there. You don't see many churches that have a sign out front saying Quakers. You will see a church every now and then called the Friends Church, and that's a Quaker church. Quakers, I think, have evolved quite a lot over the years, and I'm not sure that all Friends churches are like all other Friends churches. In fact, I think a lot of them are probably indistinguishable from many evangelical churches. But there are also some very old line Quaker churches where men sit on one side, women sit on the other. There's no service really going on, except every now and then somebody stands up and has something to say. Anyway, the Quakers were founded by a man named George Fox, and one of his converts in England was a man named William Penn. He was imprisoned for his Quaker beliefs. However, William Penn had some very good family connections, and those connections led all the way to the king, and he was able to persuade Charles II to grant him a charter in America. And that charter in America was called Penn's Woods. However, that did eventually become what we know of as Pennsylvania. Okay, I'm going to say just a little bit more. I want to talk about the faith of the founders. Something that's not much talked about, and I personally think it should be, is that much of the move toward independence came from the clergy in the colonies, the Congregationalists, the Baptists, and the Presbyterians. As a matter of fact, I've heard that King George III called the revolution the Presbyterian Revolt, probably because Presbyterians were so revolting. But nevertheless, that was what was happening. As we get a little further into this, I think I'll tell you a story about the first church that I served under John Walton out there on Long Island. Has something significant in terms of church history, I think. But I'll save that for a later day. But to talk about the Founding Fathers, generally speaking, hard to find an exception of those that we think of as Founding Fathers, they were not great churchmen. Even though we have some pretty firmly established mythology to talk about how they actually were and how committed they were to the church here in America. You have to go a long way to find any of that commitment at all in those people, again, called the Founding Fathers. George Washington, he was an Episcopalian, but he was not known of as a religious man. Someone of him said at the time that he sometimes had clergymen around him, but it was just, if you'll forgive the expression, as kind of a prop, little PR work, because while he did attend church quarterly, he did refuse to take communion. At least that's what I have heard of Washington. You may have heard about Thomas Jefferson, that he took 2 New Testaments, and he took a pair of scissors and some glue, and he cut up those New Testaments to create his own version of the Bible. And what he did was to cut out everything supernatural about Jesus, everything from the virgin birth to the resurrection. And what he was left with was essentially the ethical teachings of Jesus, which was the part of Jesus that he agreed with. Alexander Hamilton, he was asked why the Constitution did not mention God. And he said, we forgot. Okay, well, it's often said that the founding fathers were primarily deists, and it probably seems to be true from everything I can gather anyway, and I've done a fair amount of reading and all this stuff. Deism essentially, to sum it up in no doubt unfairly ways, believed that God created the world and then basically said, okay, y'all, best of luck. Basically just God took his hands off of things and let it go. But there were certainly influences among the churches in the way America developed. One example is that James Madison, who of course was a president, but also was very influential in the writing of the Constitution. He was a graduate of that College of New Jersey, and at that time one of his professors had been John Witherspoon, who was actually the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. Witherspoon was a Scottish Presbyterian, taught James Madison all about Calvinism, and no doubt all about Calvin's theory of government, representative democracy, balance of powers, and all that kind of thing, which certainly was reflected when the Constitution was developed. Okay, just wanted to say a few things about that. Oh, there's one other thing I did want to talk about. So before we leave the Founding Fathers totally behind, and that is that when they did write the Constitution, one of the things that they famously did was establish a prohibition against a state religion. Why did they do that? Well, I think there were probably two reasons. One was that being deists, they were not likely to want there to be an established state religion. They were primarily, I think it's fair to say, secularists. So that was a big part, I think, of it. There was another thing about that, and that was that in the colonies there were different churches that were that had greater influence in those colonies. And so if they had picked any one of them to be the official state religion, there is no way that Constitution would have ever been ratified. So if they were going to create a new nation with a new Constitution, that was probably the only way they were going to get it done. And so that is what they did. Okay, now I have not talked about Presbyterianism in the New World, and we are going to do that, but we're going to do it at a later time. So I thank you for listening into this, and I look forward to our next chapter.